Hello, and welcome to our podcast episode number 53. Reunited, and it feels so good. I am Timothy, and I'm here with my friend Thomas. Today, we are going to talk about the return of the Musketeers. As always, spoilers ahead. The Return of the Musketeers is a 1989 film adaptation based on the novel 20 Years After by Alexandre Dumas. It follows the story of the three Musketeers, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, who are reunited 20 years after their previous adventures to stop Cardinal Mazarin's evil plans. So, Tom, what were your initial thoughts?
Well, Tim, I have to say that it's been quite some time since we've seen our favorite Musketeers on the big screen. And while I was a bit hesitant about the casting choices, especially with regards to Aramis, I have to admit that the film managed to capture my attention right from the get-go.
Interesting. I wasn't quite as impressed, I must say. Don't get me wrong, it was enjoyable enough, but I found myself getting a bit bored at times. The story felt a bit too convoluted for its own good, and some of the characters weren't as well developed as I would have liked.
Well, Tim, I think that's where our differences in opinion lie. For me, it was all about the action and adventure, which this film certainly delivered. Plus, I thought the introduction of Athos' son Raoul added an intriguing layer to the storyline.
Well, give you that much. Thomas Raoul's character did add some intrigue to the story. But for me, it felt a bit forced and unnecessary. The original story of 20 years after already had so many plot points, to deal with that, adding Athos' son just seemed like an afterthought. Speaking of which, I thought the portrayal of Cardinal Mazarin in this adaptation was quite interesting. In the book, he comes across as a much more cunning and manipulative character. Yeah. They played him up as more of a buffoonish villain, which took away from his menace. What did you think about that aspect, Thomas?
I agree with you on some points there, Timothy. I also felt like Raoul's presence wasn't entirely necessary to the story. However, I quite enjoyed the comedic element brought by Mazarin in this adaptation. It provided a nice balance between action and humor, which kept me engaged throughout the film. Plus, Richard Chamberlain did an excellent job playing him. Now, let's talk about one of my favorite parts of the movie, the fight sequences. They were absolutely breathtaking. The choreography was top-notch and really showcased the talents of the stunt team. What are your thoughts on the action scenes in this film?
Well, I can't deny that the fight scenes were well executed, but they felt a bit too over the top for my taste. The Musketeers seemed to defy gravity at times, and some of their moves just didn't seem feasible. It took me out of the story and made it feel more like a cartoonish parody than an adaptation of Dumas's classic novel. That being said, I did appreciate how they incorporated some historical elements into the action scenes. The part where Raoul uses a cannon to save Athos from drowning was quite impressive and showed some attention to detail regarding naval warfare during that period. What were your thoughts on those historical aspects in The Return of the Musketeers, Tom?
Well, I have to admit that there were moments when the action did verge on being a bit too much, but overall, I thought it added to the excitement of the film. As for the historical elements you mentioned, Timothy, I agree that they were quite interesting and added depth to certain scenes. Speaking of which, let's talk about Justine de Winter, Milady's daughter. Her character was quite intriguing as she sought revenge against Athos for his role in her mother's death. The twist where we find out that the Comte de la Fère is actually her father was a nice surprise. What did you think about Justine's character and the revelation about her true parentage?
I didn't quite buy into the whole Justine subplot, to be honest. It felt like they were trying too hard to create another antagonist when Milady herself was such a compelling villain in the original story. As for the reveal about her father, it wasn't entirely unexpected given their previous encounters, but still felt rather contrived and unnecessary.
Now, what did you think about the portrayal of the Musketeers themselves in this adaptation? I found myself missing the camaraderie and banter that we saw in the earlier films. It felt like they were more focused on individual storylines rather than their relationships with each other. Well, Tim, I have to say that I actually enjoyed the portrayal of the Musketeers in this adaptation. While it's true that there wasn't as much focus on their camaraderie as we saw in previous films, I felt like each character was given enough depth and development for us to understand their motivations better. Porthos, in particular, stood out for me with his newfound sense of duty towards France. Aramis also had some interesting moments where he struggled between his duties as a bishop-elect and his loyalty to the Musketeers. As for Athos, I thought John Rhys Davies did an admirable job portraying the aging musketeer who still has some fight left in him. What about you, Timothy? Did you have any favorite moments or characters from the Return of the Musketeers?
Well, I have to say that I didn't quite connect with any of the characters as much as I had hoped. They felt a bit too one-dimensional for my taste. As for behind-the-scenes tidbits, I read somewhere that during filming Richard Chamberlain was quite ill and had to be hospitalized for part of the shoot. This caused some delays in production, which led to the decision to cut down on the comedic elements, as they wanted to focus more on finishing the film rather than perfecting the humor. It's just a shame that such circumstances had to impact the final product.
That's quite an interesting tidbit about Richard Chamberlain's illness, Tim. It certainly does explain some of the choices they made during production. Now, let's talk about one of my favorite parts of this film, the set design. The production design team really went all out to create a visually stunning world that transported you back to 17th century France. From the lavish costumes to the intricately detailed sets, every element added to the overall atmosphere of the movie. What did you think about the visual aspects in The Return of the Musketeers?
I have to agree with you there, Thomas. The production design was indeed quite impressive. They really managed to capture the essence of 17th century France, especially with regards to the costumes and set pieces. It's just a shame that some of these efforts were overshadowed by the convoluted storyline and poor character development. But overall, it was an enjoyable enough experience for me.
Well, Tim, I'm glad you enjoyed it at least partly. Personally, I think this film is a testament to Richard Lester's directing skills, as he managed to keep the audience engaged despite some of its flaws. And who can resist a good swashbuckling adventure every now and then? As for what we can expect from future episodes of our podcast, stay tuned, because next week we'll be discussing another classic movie adapted from literature, The Princess Bride. We hope you'll join us for that discussion too.
Well, I have to say that while The Return of the Musketeers may not be a perfect adaptation of 20 years after, it does capture some of the essence of Alexandre Dumas's novel. One of the key differences between the book and the film is the focus on character development. In the novel, we see more of Athos' struggles with his past, as well as Raoul's journey from innocent youth to a man haunted by guilt. The political intrigue in 20 years after is also more complex than what was presented in the film adaptation, with Cardinal Mazarin playing an even larger role in him, and the plot.
That's an interesting point, Timothy. While I enjoyed the action-packed nature of this film adaptation, it's true that some aspects were sacrificed for the sake of cinematic thrills. In terms of character development, I feel like we didn't get to see enough of Aramis and his internal struggle between duty and faith. Porthos also felt a bit underutilized in this version compared to his portrayal in the book, where he played a more significant role in the plot.
Well, I agree with you there, Thomas. However, it is important to note that adaptations are often a balancing act between staying true to the source material and making it accessible for a wider audience. In this case, perhaps they focus too much on the action and adventure aspects at the expense of character development.
Speaking of which, let's talk about one of my favorite parts from 20 years after the scene, where Aramis fights the cardinal's guards while disguised as an old woman. That was such a memorable moment in the novel, and I was hoping they would include it in this film adaptation. What did you think about that particular scene, Tim?
While I agree that the disguise sequence was quite entertaining, I felt like it didn't really add much to the overall story. It seemed more like an excuse for some comic relief rather than a necessary part of the plot. In any case, it certainly was a fun addition to the book and provided some lighthearted moments among all the political intrigue.
That's true, Tim. And I suppose that's one of the challenges of adapting a novel like 20 years after finding the right balance between action, adventure, character development, and historical accuracy. Despite its flaws, The Return of the Musketeers does capture some of the essence of Dumas's storytelling and provides an entertaining viewing experience for fans of swashbuckling adventures.
Said Tom.
I think we can both agree that while this adaptation might not be perfect,
It is an enjoyable enough watch, especially if you're in the mood for some old-fashioned action and adventure. And who knows, maybe future adaptations will find a way to strike a better balance between these elements while still staying true to Alexandre Dumas' original vision.
Well said, Tim. Now, let's talk about the cast of this film, shall we? Personally, I think they did an amazing job bringing these iconic characters to life on screen. Starting with Richard Chamberlain as Aramis, he brought a sense of elegance and intelligence to the role that really captured my attention. His portrayal of the conflicted bishop-elect was both compelling and emotionally resonant.
I agree with you there, Thomas. Richard Chamberlain certainly embodied the spirit of Aramis quite well. However, I do feel that his performance felt a bit restrained compared to some of his co-stars, such as Oliver Reed, who played Athos. His portrayal of the aging musketeer was marked by a sense of weariness and regret, but also an underlying strength that made him quite endearing to the audience.
That's very true, Tim. Oliver Reed's performance as Athos was indeed quite memorable. He managed to capture both the vulnerability and resilience of the character beautifully. As for Raquel Welch as Constance Bonacieux, she brought a sense of feminine allure mixed with steely determination that made her portrayal quite unique. Her chemistry with Charlton Heston's D'Artagnan was also quite palpable, which added an interesting dynamic to their scenes together.
Well, said Thomas, it's clear that Raquel Welch brought a certain charm and charisma to her role as Constance Bonacieux. However, I have to say that one of my favorite performances in this film was from Michael Gothard, who played the villainous Duke of... He exuded an aura of cold-blooded cruelty, but also had these moments where you could see the character's insecurities and fears bubbling beneath the surface, which made him all the more compelling to watch.
That's a great point, Tim. Michael Gothard definitely brought a layered complexity to his portrayal of Duke of Nevers. And speaking of villains, let's not forget about Christopher Lee as Rochefort. His menacing presence and sarcastic wit added an extra dimension to the character that really elevated his scenes in the film. It was clear that he had a lot of fun playing this role, which only served to enhance his performance even further.
I completely agree with you there, Tom. Christopher Lee's portrayal of Rochefort was truly iconic and added an extra layer of excitement to every scene he appeared in. And while we're on the subject of villain, let's not forget about the character of Milady de Winter, played by Faye Dunaway. Her performance was both captivating and chilling as she effortlessly switched between charm and cold-blooded ruthlessness. It really was a tour de force from an incredibly talented actress.
Indeed, it was, Tim. And now that we've talked about some of the standout performances in The Return of the Musketeers, let's discuss how these actors worked together as a team to bring this story to life on screen. Do you have any thoughts or observations about their chemistry?
Well, Tom, I must say that while there was some genuine moments of camaraderie between the Musketeers and their allies, it's clear that the cast members had varying degrees of screen time, which did impact their interactions with each other. However, they all managed to bring their A game and create a sense of excitement and adventure that carried the film from beginning to end.
That's a fair point, Tim. And speaking of camaraderie, let's not forget about the relationship between D'Artagnan and Constance Bonacieux, which provided some much-needed light-hearted moments in an otherwise quite dark story. What did you think about Charlton Heston's portrayal of D'Artagnan?
Well, Tom, I have to say that Charlton Heston was a bit of an acquired taste for me as D'Artagnan. His performance felt somewhat stiff and lacking in the charm and charisma that the character is known for. However, he did have some moments where you could see glimpses of the dashing musketeer shining through, which was quite endearing.
I can understand your reservations about Charlton Heston's portrayal of D'Artagnan, Tim. However, I feel that his more stoic and serious take on the character worked quite well within the context of this adaptation. It allowed for a stronger focus on the political intrigue and personal struggles of the Musketeers, as opposed to relying solely on their comedic antics to carry the story forward.
That's an interesting perspective, Tom. And now, let's wrap things up by talking about Richard Lester's direction and how it contributed to the overall success of The Return of the Musketeers. What did you think about his approach to this film?
Well, Tim, I believe that Richard Lester brought a sense of energy and playfulness to The Return of the Musketeers, which helped to balance out some of its more serious themes. His use of humor was quite effective in lightening the mood during tense situations and adding depth to certain characters such as Aramis and Rochefort. Additionally, his action sequences were expertly choreographed and filled with thrilling set pieces that kept the audience engaged throughout the film.
I completely agree with you there, Tom. Richard Lester's direction was indeed quite impressive in this film. His ability to balance humor, action, and drama is truly commendable. And as for what we can expect from future episodes of our podcast, stay tuned, because next week we'll be discussing another classic movie adapted from literature, The Princess Bride. We hope you'll join us for that discussion too.
Well, Tim, I think it's also worth discussing the cultural impact and legacy of The Return of the Musketeers. As one of the earliest examples of swashbuckling adventure films, it paved the way for many similar productions followed in its wake. It not only captivated audiences with its thrilling action sequences and grandiose storytelling, but also introduced generations to the timeless characters created by Alexandre Dumas.
I agree with you there, Tom. The Return of the Musketeers has certainly left a lasting imprint on popular culture.
Its influence can be seen in countless films, TV shows, and even books that have followed over the years, from the countless reimaginings of the original story to the countless references and homages it's inspired in other works. It's clear that this film holds a special place in the hearts of many.
That's very true, Tim. And what about you, Tom? As someone who has experienced both the novel and this adaptation firsthand, how do you feel the Return of the Musketeers compares to other adaptations or retellings of Dumas's story? Are there any specific elements that stood out to you as being particularly faithful or innovative in their approach?
Well, Tom, I have to say that while this adaptation is not without its flaws, it manages to capture the essence of Alexandre Dumas's storytelling quite effectively. It certainly stands out among other adaptations due to Richard Lester's distinctive blend of action humor and drama, which adds a unique spin on the classic tale. As for innovation, I think this film introduces some interesting new elements, such as the romantic subplot between D'Artagnan and A.M. Constance Bonacieux, which provides an extra layer of depth to their characters' relationships.
That's an interesting perspective, Tim. And now that we've discussed the cultural impact and legacy of the Return of the Musketeers, let's turn our attention to future installments in this podcast series. As you mentioned earlier, next week we'll be discussing another classic movie adapted from literature, The Princess Bride. Are there any specific aspects or themes from that film you're looking forward to exploring further during our discussion?
I believe that The Princess Bride is another excellent example of a film that manages to capture the spirit of its source material while also adding its own unique twist on things. I'm particularly excited about discussing the role played by humor in this movie, as it serves not only as comic relief, but also helps to heighten emotional moments and deepen character development throughout the story. Additionally, I'm looking forward to exploring how director Rob Reiner managed to blend elements of fantasy adventure and romance so seamlessly into one cohesive narrative that appeals across generations.
I completely agree with you there, Tim. And now that we've discussed the cultural impact and legacy of the Return of the Musketeers, let's wrap things up by sharing our final thoughts on the film. Overall, I found it to be a thoroughly entertaining and engaging adaptation that stays true to the spirit of Alexandre Dumas' original work while adding its own unique flair. From the excellent performances by the cast to Richard Lester's skilled direction, this movie is sure to please fans both old and new.
Well said, Tom. And I must say it was a true delight discussing this film with you. As always, your insights and perspectives added so much depth to our conversation about the Return of the Musketeers. So before we sign off for today, let's leave our dear viewers with one last thought. If you haven't yet had the pleasure of experiencing this swashbuckling adventure for yourself, do yourself a favor and check it out. You won't be disappointed.
And now that we've reached the end of another thrilling episode of Tim and Tom's Film Nights, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below so you never miss an installment. And while you're at it, leave us a comment letting us know your thoughts on the Return of the Musketeers or any other movies we've discussed in the past. We love hearing from our fans and engaging with the amazing community that has grown around our little podcast. So until next time, keep watching those films and sharing your passion for storytelling with others.